Today, cities can seem very distant from the farms and forests that surround them, but historically, the fate of cities was often tied to the success of nearby agriculture. Medieval market towns relied on trading with the farmers and shepherds that entered through their walled gates. In the 19th century, an agricultural and transportation revolution suddenly made vast amounts of land in the American interior accessible to Europeans. The transformation of the landscape then created the scope for great cities, like Chicago and Buenos Aires, that grew rich as conduits for the wealth of the hinterland of the Americas. 2 centuries ago, Americans lived on the edge of an enormously fertile continent. Yet those agricultural riches were largely outside their grasp because transportation costs were so high. In 1816, it cost as much to ship goods 30 miles over land as it did to ship them across the entire Atlantic Ocean. And so our ancestors, like Tantalus in the pit, were keenly aware of fruits that were beyond their grasp and desperate to grab all that could be produced by America's rich soil. Over the course of the 19th century, North and South Americans solved their transportation problem by building a remarkable infrastructure network. First canals and then rail lines resulted in millions rushing to plant and herd on the plains and the pampas. Cities grew up on pinch points of that transportation network. Buffalo, the western terminus of the Erie Canal, was built on a spot where Joseph Dart's pioneering grain elevators would carry wheat from the larger boats that traversed the Great Lakes onto canal-going barges. Louisville, Kentucky emerged where boats had to be unloaded before they hit the falls of the Ohio River. Every one of America's 20 largest cities in 1900 was on a major waterway, from the oldest, New York and Boston, typically located where the river meets the sea, to the youngest, Minneapolis, on the northernmost navigable point on the Mississippi River. Chicago was the greatest of America's inland cities, and it first grew because it seemed fated to be the linchpin of a great watery arc that reached from New York to New Orleans. As it turned out, Chicago would owe at least as much to rail lines as to canals. William Cronin's Nature's Metropolis is one of the great urban books written during my lifetime. It tells the story of Chicago and its debts to the enormous agricultural wealth of Illinois and Iowa and Wisconsin. Then as now, American farms have a tremendous capacity to grow corn. But the problem with corn is that it has a low value per ton, and consequently it is relatively expensive to ship. This problem was traditionally solved by transforming the corn into something else, something more valuable. The farmers of western Pennsylvania turned corn into portable, potable whiskey, and they actually rebelled when President Washington tried to tax that whiskey. The farmers of the Ohio River Valley turned corn into pigs. For whatever reason, human beings have long preferred salted pork to salted beef, and pigs are really just corn with feet. And so Cincinnati grew up as America's Porkopolis, the spot where pigs were salted for shipment to the east. The farmland is even richer further west, and cows are better at moving longer distances on their own. So Chicago's largest industry by value added, second largest by employment, was its stockyards. It was the place where cows by the thousand were slaughtered and shipped. The rise of Chicago's stockyards depended upon another major transportation innovation, the invention of refrigerated rail cars, which is associated with the great meatpacking firm of Gustavus Swift. The big idea was to put the blocks of ice on top of the dressed beef rather than beneath them. Chicago roared as the town at the heart of America's agricultural empire, attracting inventors like Cyrus McCormick, who moved west to sell his mechanical reapers. On the other side of the equator, Buenos Aires followed a roughly similar path. Argentine farmland is just as rich as American farmland. Transportation innovations, including railroads and the famed frigorificos, boats that carried refrigerated beef across the Atlantic, were similarly crucial to Buenos Aires' success. Like Chicago, Buenos Aires benefited from a late 19th century flood of immigrants who created a vividly cosmopolitan city. By the start of the 20th century, Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world, and Buenos Aires was its glittering capital, a city built, like Chicago, on nature's bounty. A century later, the parallels between Buenos Aires and Chicago would no longer seem so close. Indeed, the relative decline of Argentina has been one of the great economic tragedies of the 20th century. In a sense, the divergence of Buenos Aires and Chicago is a story of nations, the divergence of Argentina and the U.S., countries which were once so similar that immigrants saw little difference between going north and going south. But it turns out that there were differences between the two cities in 1900 which foretold their different paths. Chicago was always a much better educated city than Buenos Aires, largely because Midwestern farmers invested in education. Nearby Iowa was the birthplace of America's high school movement. The larger plantation owners of Argentina saw little upside in schooling. The education gap helps explain the technology gap that existed between the two countries. In the 19th century, Chicago was on the world's innovation frontier, creating new inventions like the skyscraper, the vacuum cleaner, the zipper, and open-heart surgery. Buenos Aires was much more likely to import inventions from Europe and the US. Chicago's human capital enabled it to move easily from agriculture to industry. Buenos Aires' move was later and less successful. Buenos Aires suffered even more from Argentina's political instability during the 20th century. The country veered from democracy to dictatorship, from openness to economic isolation. That too owes some debt to lower education levels, which are pervasively correlated with dictatorship and political disorder. Both cities owed their growth to agriculture, but in the Midwest, farmers plowed their agricultural wealth into the minds of their children and sowed the seeds for longer-term success. In Argentina, 19th century wealth made the country prosperous, but despite the heroic attempts of Argentine apostles of education like Domingo Sarmiento, Buenos Aires schools lagged far behind. And ultimately, cities, like nations and like people, rise and fall based on their human capital.